All right, everybody. So here's the problem right from the homework. In fact, I'll actually try to work it as it is here. I'll submit the answer the way you would, but I think it's a good one to show you. The reason is I think it forces us to confront the notation of calculus because you can learn the rules of calculus and go through the motions with that. But here, this original function is not given. I have some information about it, but I don't know the function itself, and so it might be a little tricky to apply the rules to it. So I've summarized it on my own work, but I'll say it like this. There's this function h of x, which is f of g of x. I know g of 6 and g prime of 6, and I want h prime of 6. Okay, so I'll summarize that a little differently than it is in that question on MyMathLab, and I'll say it this way. I want to find the derivative of this unknown function. Here's what we have. There's this function h of x, which is a composition of functions. It's f of g of x. By composition of functions, you have to think like there's an order of operations, where if I was going to do calculations with this function, I would have to find g of x first, figure out what that number was, and then find f of that number. So you think there's a chain. There's an order that things have to be done. G first, do that calculation, whatever that function is, then f, all right? So that's a composition of functions, and when we encounter that in calculus, the rule for the derivative is the chain rule. So I've got a composition, and I know g of 6 is 2, and I know g prime of 6 is negative 4. What I want is h prime of 6, but the question asked me specifically, what am I missing if that's what I wanted to calculate, all right? That's what the question is asking on MyMathLab. So we would use the chain rule. I think I've established that. The chain rule might be written different ways, though. And I mean, that's part of the challenge with math, is there might be different notations and different ways to express rules and formulas based on the different notations. Here's the way that I think you'll see it. I mean, some variation of these. The derivative with respect to x of some function f of g of x, some composition, is f prime of g of x times g prime of x. That's the chain rule in its most basic form, I would say. We could also say it this way. If u is a function of x and y is a function of u, okay, ultimately y is a function of x because there's a chain, right? You take x, you calculate u. Once you have u, you calculate y. All right, it's no different than this. Now, these are both saying exactly the same thing, okay? But what it forces us to confront is the notation of calculus. Here I'm forced to understand the symbols. I'm forced to understand notation. And that might be a big part of you learning to do calculus, is learning how to read all the symbols. I think that's an important part of doing math in general. There's the skill of doing math, but then there's learning what all the symbols mean and how to read those symbols in the rules that they're given to you. Okay, so you might see the chain rule in those two forms. I think this first one is obviously more applicable to the way we're given this. If you want the derivative of h of x, and that function is a composition, f of g of x, then here's this derivative. It's f prime of g of x times g prime of x. So I've used that. There's our derivative. Okay, now we know some of this stuff. If I want h prime of 6, okay, I'll put 6 in there, and I'll get f prime of g of 6 times g prime of 6. And yeah, we have some of that information. G prime of 6, or g of 6 is 2. So this says f prime of 2, whatever that is. And then this g prime of 6, so that's negative 4. Okay, so we're like working this down. With my formula, I expressed what the derivative would be. You want the derivative at this number. I put that in. I have some of that information. So it seems like I'm getting there, all right? But I can't take it all the way. I need this. If I was going to calculate this all the way, I need f prime of 2, okay? So that's what's stopping me from going any further and getting a final answer to whatever this would be. All right. So do you see we have the situation? We identify the rule. We apply the rule. We use the given information, but then we get stuck. All right, so the thing I'm missing is f prime of 2. So I'll select it that way. I mean, I've got all these choices here, but this is the one that I don't have is keeping me from my ultimate calculation. So I'll check it and it's right. Okay, so I hope you see, obviously, like I make this because I want you to see how to solve this particular problem, but I also want to get you thinking about the challenge of just the notation. Okay, that when you learn calculus, there's a skill to doing the math and seeing the patterns, and there's problem solving skill, but there's also the additional task, the additional skill of learning to read the notation and not being confused by it. So I want you to think about all of that as you think about this problem and as you learn everything else.